Lord, we bless your name and thank you and love you, Lord, for what you are doing in us and continuing to grow in us, Lord. We bless you for, Lord, your trust in us, Lord, your faith in us. So may we continue to have faith in you, Father, and Lord, the doings and the purposes of your life. I pray for this time that you Lord, just would lay heavy on our hearts and that we would be ready to learn of your ways and from each other, and that we would continue to take in perspective of what this time means and the culture that we are wanting to build. Pray a blessing on this day and for each one that participates. I praise in your name. Amen.
Amen. Well, let's start our discussion. Who read last? We're gonna be moving into 12:9.
I think it was me and Esther.
I was gonna make you read again too.
I mean, I'll read
Me,
again.
Kayla, Esther,
Okay, so today will be Isaac and then and then Benji for 12:9.
Duke said to Master Yu, "The harvest was poor, and I cannot satisfy my needs. What should I do?" How do you actually say that? You? You say you?
Yeah.
Master Yu said,
Which one? Oh, Master Yu. What was the first one though? Duke I?
Duke I? I don't know.
Oh, wait.
AI?
Yeah.
Said to Master
That's why I
Yu.
said Duke A.
Wait, hold on. The first one would be yo.
Yo?
Yeah.
You say AI, yo?
The first Duke of I said to Master yo.
Oh, okay.
Duke I said to Master Yo. Okay.
Sorry, yes.
Start over, Isaac. We're all straightened
Yes.
up now at 10:10. Perfect.
Duke I said to Master Yo, "The harvest was poor, and I cannot satisfy my needs. What should I do?" Master Yo said, "Why do you not try taxing the people 1 part in 10? I am currently taxing them 2 parts in 10, and even so, I cannot satisfy my needs. How could reducing the tax to 1 part in 10 help?" Master Yo stated, "If the common people's needs are satisfied, how could their lord be lacking? If the common people's needs are not satisfied, how can their lord be content?"
Okay, so I'm gonna draw some of my communications class into this class because I'm gonna start to basically require higher expectation of you guys in reading, and this has nothing to do with you doing something that you shouldn't have done or anything like that. But I want us to learn to become good readers. So I have a couple of challenges for you. One is when you read things and personally, I want you to practice reading at least 1/4, 25% of what you read aloud. The more you do, the better. When you do read aloud, I want you to try to characterize what you're reading as much as you can. In other words, when you have something like this, I want you to, there are 2 different people here, and I want you to basically read as if you are 2 different characters, so that there is a great distinction and between that. And you will be able to do this much better if you practice it alone, on a regular basis. You should apply this to much that you read. If you don't read that much, then this isn't going to be that great a practice for you, for obvious reasons. So, if we go back, and there's a narration here too, which is Duke AI, or Duke I said to, is it Duke A? Duke I? Chuckle Num? Which is it?
It's Duke I think.
Duke I. It's funny how things sound funny in your language when it's coming from another language. So, admittedly. So, this is a bit of a situation of distress, and then a situation of kind of frustration and curiosity, and then, a comment from the wise. Duke I said to Master Yo, "The harvest was poor, and I cannot satisfy my needs. What should I do?" Master Yo said, "Why do you not try taxing the people 1 part in 10? I am currently taxing them 2 parts in 10, and even so, I cannot satisfy my needs. How could reducing the tax to 1 part in 10 help?" Master Yo answered, "If the common people's needs are satisfied, how could their Lord be lacking? If the common people's needs are not satisfied, how can the Lord be content?" Now let me ask you, and Isaac, again, this has nothing to do with you. You're just the unfortunate soul that read first. So you became the object of my lesson here. Not you personally, but this reading. When you read that way, now even understanding the situation, do you have a better understanding of the situation now? Yeah, because it was people talking. And that's exactly what it was. It was a conversation. So the lesson here is, and what we want to practice is, especially when we read, you can read the weather, and it's like, the high today is going to be 87, and the low is going to be 42, and that's not really conversational. That is literally just numbers and information being shared. Okay? But when you read conversation, it needs to be conversation in your mind. It should be conversation coming out of your mouth. Reading is both a privilege and should be a bit of a joy, not necessarily because you enjoy sitting down to read something so much, but because reading is an expression. And with good expression comes better understanding. So that's one of my primary lessons in our communications class. And one of the primary focuses on our current assignment. So, now, as you read the next section, that may or may not be a conversation until we read from the Garden of Persuasions, which is, again, another conversation. So, do your best.
All right.
According to the annals, the traditional 10% tithe from agricultural production was doubled by Duke Sean of Lu in 593 BCE, and then continued as standard practice. It is possible that this exchange between Duke I and Master Yo took place during the Lu famine of 484 BCE, year 14 of Duke A's reign, which occurred after back-to-back plagues of locust in 484 and 483 BCE. Master Yo is thus suggesting a return to a taxation rate over 100 years old, quite a radical cutback. Probably the best commentary on this passage is a story from the Garden of Persuasions. Duke I of Lu asked Confucius about governing. Confucius replied, "The purpose of the government is to make the common people rich." Duke I asked, "What do you mean by that?" Confucius said, "Lighten the burden of levies and taxes, and this will make the common people rich." The Duke replied, "If I did that, then I myself would become poor." Confucius responded, "An ode says, 'All happiness to our gentleman, ruler, father, and mother of his people.' Ode 251. I have never seen a situation where the children were rich and the parents poor." Page 844, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
The point, of course, is that if the Duke comported himself as the parent of his people, as he probably should, his sole concern would be for their welfare, not his own financial needs.
Okay, comments?
I think we see another common thing mentioned here in this book, which is kind of how to think as a ruler, and how to act in a way of rulership and that kind of mindset. And there's and that obviously has a lot to do with what, in which way you're interacting or taking care of your own people that you are in rulership of. And I think taxation is something that has been very prevalent, especially in those times with peoples. But I think we can look at it maybe on a smaller scale as well, and how someone is to look after. I mean, I like the comparison I made to someone looking over their own children, because I think that's the same way you should maybe under a similar mindset rule a people. But we don't really have that same kind of order in peoples anymore in today's time, so that can be applied in different ways now. But yeah, that was something Emmanuel talked a lot about when we read these things, was thinking like a king or a prince.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think kind of talking, 'cause taxing people was pretty, it seemed to even change a lot of people's lives because of the way they had to show their loyalty to their king by doing these things. But it shouldn't be in a way that's not benefiting the people.
So for those of you who, well, it doesn't matter. What is taxation for? In any, what is it, was taxation for in any government? Doesn't really matter the form of government. What's the purpose of taxation? In this context, we're talking about a king or emperor, or, a duke over a certain area, where the taxes that he collects are from the people within that boundary. What are they for?
Is it supposed to be going into bettering the nation, or like the
That
place
area?
itself?
How so? Yes, it is.
Like funds for
How do funds make things better?
I guess if there's damages in certain areas, the funds can go to getting the supplies to rebuild it again.
Okay, that's a good use. What else?
Could it be used for medical purposes?
Can?
I think it's kind of for the ruler himself, and a lot of the times, I mean, some rulers used it for themselves, but I think essentially it's to be given back to the people, right? In a way.
How?
Because it's, well, if we think about how we do our own taxes now, we pay them to the government, but we get that tax return on tax day. So it's, what? It's,
You don't know what you're paying taxes for, do you?
well, it's for, it's kind of what Kayla mentioned. Our taxes are for things that we use. They're for public services.
Okay, that's good. Yep. Sorry, I worded that in a way that was a little bit of a dig, and it was not meant to be that. So I was
Yeah,
wanting
I-
us to open up our understanding of even why we pay
I'm just saying, I think
taxes
it's
in this
hard to say
nation.
one thing what
What's it
taxes
for?
are
It's
for.
it's not for one thing. And so there's a good use of taxes, and that's why taxes are such an issue, and they always have been, because it's very difficult for the people of for the people who are paying them, regardless of the government under which they or unto which they are paying them, to have what we might call transparency with how that money is being used. Okay, so the more difficult it is to see how much money is collected from who and where it goes, like into what coffer, whose bank account does it go into, or what bank account does it go into, and then what's that final number look like, and then what is being done with that final number, and who is part of making decisions with whatever that final number is and where it goes. That would be a fully transparent process. However, in the history of man, there has been very little transparency with the collection of basically taxes from other people. And that has been the cause of a lot of unrest, politically and otherwise, in the midst of a nation. Sometimes those things lead to violence. Many times they already have. All for a lack of transparency and for what is a propensity to greed, which is what Elijah talked about. So it's very easy, especially when you are in these types of scenarios where you have a singular leader who may have other advisors, as in most of these scenarios, but are they being transparent with, or are they dealing righteously with what they are taking from the people? So dealing righteously can have two different aspects. One is specifically how and for what those monies are used, because the governing agent, whether that is an agency of people or if it is a duke like this, should also be paid for his work. So how would that individual determine the balance of what his pay is versus what is collected and what would be deemed good or right for the common person? So that's part of what's being laid out here. And that's part of what is being drawn out as to what is an expectation of a leader. So remember the entire perspective of leadership in the context of the Confucian understanding of the appointments of leadership are that those are divine appointments. Those are people that are appointed to the position that they are put in by God. And therefore, they should do what they do in a certain way. And it especially applies to governance. Now, interestingly, this principle here that is stated, because it ties directly into filial responsibility, which is what? What is filial responsibility? Or filial duty? Come on now, we've read these things.
It's a duty to one's parents.
Yeah. So, how you are to consider and care for your parents at all the stages of life. Whether you're young and under their tutelage still, under their home, under their care, whether you have separated from their home and now from the household, but you still have a certain relationship with them, and then what you do when they are in their time of need. At what point does that happen? How do you work it out? What will you carry on after they're gone? That's all a part of filial duty. So there's an underlying principle that is drawn back to, that is reminiscent of some other things that Confucius has said in relation to, I think it was his student, why did his name just, who's his student that's kind of brash and...
Zulu?
Yeah, Zulu, okay. I think Zulu asked of him, how do I change the world? And what was his answer?
You start in the home, and it goes, was that his answer?
Even more fundamental than that.
Well, you start yourself.
Okay. And then?
And then the home.
Yeah. And then?
Your community.
Yeah.
And then your city.
Uh-huh.
Your kingdom.
And then the world.
And then the world.
And so there's an overlap here of some other principles, filial duty, as well as where do we substantiate real change. And just because you're in a place of leadership doesn't mean that you are exempt from where and how those changes come to be, how they work out. So there's a principle to be applied. So with that in mind, you guys make some further comments about this particular intellect. Quiet bunch today.
Something that stands out to me here is that the ruler has to consider himself like different, fundamentally different from the common people, in the sense that he should not act like them in his pursuit of what is good for himself, because it's kind of taken as a given that the common people want what is best for themselves in the same way that children would. But that the gentleman or the ruler needs to operate as such in a way that would seem somewhat contradictory to that small man or that common man attitude towards life, which is what would be best for myself. How do I fulfill my own needs and the needs of my clan? Which in that excerpt we saw from the Garden of Persuasion, Duke I actually did kind of express that perspective of the small man when he said, if I did that, then I myself would become poor. That's how the common people think. But to be a true ruler, you actually have to think in, again, a very fundamentally selfless way. So, and I think the same way that a good parent would.
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely a sacrificial element to that. But you don't foolishly extend and then misapply that perspective to the common people, saying, well, everybody should be that way. That would be to expect more maturity out of a child than one should expect. Obviously, it's not necessarily the government's job to enforce that and on at that scale, because what that would ultimately lead to, I think, is a return to selfishness, as opposed to the selflessness that the ruler should have as a kind of parent of his people.
Mm-hmm.
And what takes place as a result is not actually the poverty of the ruler or the gentleman in this case, but he earns the respect and the love of his people, the common people, the small man. And I think that actually is the starting point for what can then be an opportunity for the common people to mature. Mm-hmm. Beyond that I keep using the word fundamental on purpose, that fundamental perspective of self-centeredness. What is being done for the betterment of myself and my own people, my own family.
Mm-hmm. So there's very much an outward look that when the whole is benefited, then all are benefited.
Yeah, like again at the beginning of that thing, I can even see that perspective in Duke again. The harvest was poor, and I cannot satisfy my needs. But Master Yo continues. What about the people's needs?
Yeah.
You have to make that switch first before you can do anything about the people's perspective.
There's actually a very simple financial principle here. Can anybody identify it? I know that that's a bit of a vague question, but what's a very obvious financial principle here?
Well, that should be that should be secondary, I think. It seems like his hope is in financial things in order for prosperity to come.
But my point is, you're right,
Mm.
but he's overlooking a very basic financial principle.
He's looking to maintain his own way of life when the harvest was poor. So the example should be, where am I going to be cutting, and sacrificing due to a poor harvest, as an example to others that we had a bad harvest. We're gonna have to tighten it up.
I'm still digging. Cause see, and I like this. I'm glad you said that, John, because I want to point out a different way of thinking between John and I, and they don't oppose one another, and neither is wrong. Okay, it's just a different perspective. Okay, the obvious financial principle here. Let's just do the math. Okay, on what is going on in this situation. They have just come out of a low season, or double low seasons. In fact, not just low season, seasons of loss because of the plagues of locust. He is currently taking how much? 2 and 10. What is that? What's our percentage?
20%.
That's a 20% tax. Quite a bit of money, right? The suggestion is to cut that in half and only take 10%. So he's thinking, wow, I'm taking less, I'm going to make less. But what he's not thinking is the people are giving less, they will have more, okay? And to do what with? So here's where we come back down to some very basic principles of life and leadership. If we have good people, and those people are endeared to their leadership, and their leadership is endeared to them, then what do you think that those people are going to do with their quote-unquote tax break in these lean years? May seem like a bit of a gamble. Not so much. The lean years may give way, and very likely will give way to more fat years. Okay? Years with more abundance. So if the people already know that they need more, then they may invest this extra amount into giving what is more. So if your people are lean and giving everything that they can just to survive because of the tax, and they only have $100 to give, they're giving you 20 of their 100. Okay? So whatever that is, you get the $20, and the people keep their $80. All right. However, if when they have this relief and they're not trying to spend every dollar that they make just on meeting their own ends, and then they reinvest in their crop, which is specifically what this is about, then their return may be $400 instead of $100. So then, even at 10%, what does the Duke now receive? 40. Double the original. That's the potential for change. It is a exponential difference when you benefit the people. Because you're not benefiting how many people? You're not benefiting one, you're benefiting thousands. So it is the financial principle of multiples. Okay? If you could take a lesser tax on a greater amount and make more.
Increase productivity.
And everyone is what? Everyone is benefited. See the difference? That's a little different principle than some of the necessities that come when you have to cut back. And I'm not saying that there's not a necessity to come back. So that is actually some of the reality that we face is that we need to do
in the
that.
short term, he would have to sacrifice.
That's right.
For that.
That's right,
For
to
that
get to the
benefit.
long term. That's right. So that's how these work together. So that's a practical application to a longer term investment, but it could be very short as well. That's not a long investment when you give the people, when you're showing benefit to the people. When you show that benefit to the people, are they endeared to you more or not? Well, absolutely they are. Because they perceive that the one who is in leadership has their interest in mind. Now, I want to read an excerpt from, or one of the pages of the Tao Te Ching about government, which will have an overlapping principle ideal here. So, and it is this. When the master governs, the people are hardly aware that he exists. Next best is a leader who is loved. Next, one who is feared. The worst is one who is despised. If you don't trust the people, you make them untrustworthy. The master doesn't talk, he acts. When his work is done, the people say, "Amazing! We did it all by ourselves." You see, there is a way for the Duke here to act and to do that, in essence, keeps himself in a place of anonymity. But it will also draw endearment. And it will also show his entrustment of the people. If he doubles his tax, if he increases the levy from 20% to 30%, then he is, how is he going to be perceived? You know, the people are going to be very aware of what's being done there and the mentality or attitude and approach of scarcity. Have you ever seen a feeding frenzy? Have you ever watched something, the value of something? Who has ever seen videos of Black Friday? This is coming up. What happens, Naomi?
People go crazy and
Why?
because things are cheaper.
They think they are anyway.
Yeah.
But it's scarcity. What are some of the crazy things that you have seen in relation to those types of scenarios?
People like take things out of people's hands.
Start fights.
Stanley
you know.
Cups at Target.
The point is, when there is a mentality of scarcity, people kind of freak out. So if that mentality is displayed from the leadership, what do you think is going to happen to the common man? They're going to get very agitated.
Can you say that again? Scarcity what?
I don't know. What did I just say? Jen, do you remember what I just said?
In regards, I mean, not verbatim, I understand the point you made.
If the leadership acts in scarcity, then the common people are going to, here we have another exponential principle. But also some very basic understanding of how governance works, how taxation works, what it's for, what it's not for, how it should and shouldn't be used. But that comes from what is ultimately pointed at here, this basic principle and concept of basically considering the needs of others first, specifically as leadership, because that's the greatest benefit to the whole. So where we consistently see governments of all forms fail is the majority of the time found in that place. And the root of most of it is in greed. Any other thoughts?
You can even think back to a time like COVID to see what the scarcity mindset really looks like, even with goofy things like toilet paper.
Yeah.
It's really havoc and it's panic and it's all out of a place of lack. And that's not a good place to be, because it really quickly turns you against each other, because the mindset immediately goes down to just personal survival,
Mm-hmm.
neglecting everything else. I don't know why toilet paper was the target of that, but
Well, because there was news that came out that there might be a shortage. Yeah. And so it wasn't that there was a shortage yet, but the statement that there might be caused a shortage. So what was that? It was a mindset of scarcity. Mindset of scarcity. Is that what you wanted to hear?
Just
Yeah,
kind
that
of
was an interesting one. Go ahead.
it's like the shadow of Western economics, like the pillars of our understanding of its principles that nobody wants to admit, which, like someone like Adam Smith would talk about, the invisible hand, which is basically that an economy is moved by self-interest. That's actually a good thing. That everybody acting according to their own needs and wants is actually what makes an economy run. But in those kind of situations, like we're pointing out, Black Friday, COVID, things like that, are incidents that show that there's a dark side to that force present in an economy, at least as it's understood by the West. And to see an Eastern perspective of how an economy should be regulated and tempered by a ruler, as opposed to something that is just kind of it's a force primarily brought to life by a people that can only be tempered to an extent by a government that tries to maintain democracy. You could almost try to compare the two and see what the pros and cons are of each. But I would say that this more ancient perspective, which seems actually to take selflessness as its main principle, as opposed to self-centeredness, which is that invisible hand of the Western economic understanding, to be the better and more sustainable one. But it requires much more of the people who are in that place of leadership, because the reason it never worked out for this culture back in this day is because you've had too many people like Duke I, who consider themselves, in a very democratic way, you might say, if we were to apply our modern perspective of this, who considered himself as no different from the common people. He needed things too. He was in the position to make it to where he could sustain himself and live a comfortable life. And he may even have, in his limited perspective, thought that he was doing something for others apart from himself, because I think it's very important to consider not just that selfish perspective of, say, a ruler doing everything for his individual person, but he may be acting in the interest of his family, his clan, those who surround him, those who are close to him. So in a very small perspective, he could be, you might say, acting for the needs of others, but in the position that he's in, he's not really, because he's acting for those who he's interested in. So it is,
Still for
it's
himself.
still is selfish. Which is why something like a truly good government is so hard to achieve, because it depends so much on good people. And that's the kind of people that Confucius is trying to bring up and to train, are people that could be found in that position of government and sustain the way it should be, through selflessness and through interest in the common people, as a parent would his children.
And that's what I read from the Tao Te Ching, because it infers this mutual trust that the people have with those in leadership. And the fundamentals, the basic principles here, if they are all agreed upon, which I think again was the goal that Confucius had in this, was not only to develop righteous leaders, but a righteous man in general, no matter what position of life that you lived in. Because then you can be trustworthy as a commoner, and a commoner is not a derogatory term. A commoner in that sense may be more desirable because it carries with it, and by way of life responsibility, a lesser load. There's less to carry. You know, those who are, the biblical principle is what? To whom much
Which is given, which is required. I just read that last night.
did you?
Yeah, I was actually gonna say, kind of before Noah even mentioned it, was like, we think, because we're talking about the ruler here, and when you talk about rulers and talk about their people, it's easy to think of them as little pawns who are just like the
doers.
the doers, and they're like just, but like the point here, just like you were saying, is that those people are actually the greatest importance, because I think it is important to, like I was saying earlier, to have this ruler mindset, because although there are certain positions given to us in life here, there's only one king, really, and then there's citizens, but maybe citizens should have that ruler mindset, because in that way I think the kingdom can work better, because they're in the same, because they know the king's thinking, and that in that way there isn't this barrier of always being opposed or separate from the king's ways, as if you're in a different position, but you should be in the same.
Of the same mind.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of brings to consideration why, whether we do individually or not, has some relevance, but it's not my point. Why does man, for what reason does man most commonly aspire to positions of leadership and power?
Control and wealth.
Yeah, because they want to be making these kinds of decisions for themselves. So, you know, in light of what we had just mentioned and what you just expounded on a bit in relationship to the mindset that we should have in being basically the king of having kingly wisdom within the context of our life placement. Why would you need to aspire for anything more than that? So in that sense, you don't need to aspire. You should not aspire to greatness beyond not just your capacity. Don't aspire greatness beyond what you have been given or granted from above. Be content instead of contentious.
That's a tough one though, because you don't want to remain a common person at the same time. Otherwise, you start thinking like Duke I. So there's a
Well, but
there's
see,
definitely-
that is clearly or not clearly, but that is when you would only define commoner in a derogatory way. If a commoner shares the same mindset as a righteous ruler, then the commoner, quote unquote, loses its derogatory place. But in this context, you're right. Commoner is used in a derogatory way because it is meant to accentuate this lower way of thinking. But I don't think that the ultimate intention of Confucius was that everyone had or would be, you know, a commoner in that sense, but that everyone would have the different mindset, so that in essence you would be a whole nation of those who think about the whole and not just for yourself. But I was saying, what I had mentioned earlier was basically that the potential is that even the commoner could have this mindset, but I understand.
There's a kind of
that
grace
doesn't-
there in the Confucian perspective towards the small man or the commoner, because it's not. You don't. This is actually interesting because the Confucian will not pin down or chase down the common man in another person. He'll do it in himself. So it's the small man that he will be very ruthless towards if it is in himself. What he will point out in other people are what he would call, or what Confucian practitioners would call the village poser. There's another word that's a different pronunciation of poser that's used in a more scholarly sense for English speakers, but I don't remember how it's pronounced. So, but that's a small man who's basically pretending to be a gentleman. Those are the kind of people that you can point out. But there's a grace towards the true commoner who's not necessarily a village poser, because there's that understanding that we had discussed last week about native substance and cultural refinement. If you see someone that is basically like thriving in or kind of rooted in to their native substance, but there has been no opportunity for that person to be culturally refined, then there's a patience and almost a fatherliness that you apply to them, but not in a patronizing or condescending way. But it's something that you are you're practicing because it's simply the way that things are. You have had that opportunity to be culturally refined, which implies actually that you are learning to deny yourself for the sake of the common people. And in that sense, you are very, very careful about not acting in the way of the small man. So you don't do it in such a way as to explicitly or implicitly criticize the small man who may even be in your presence, but it's something that you hold as a responsibility over your own life. And in doing so, you may actually be, you will actually, this is the whole idea of the gentleman, be an example for the small people. You can't assume that you will be a teacher or a discipler for a specific person, but if the opportunity presents itself and the willingness of the person is there to be a student and a disciple, then you're given that opportunity. But the interplay and the progression of those things is just really interesting. I'd say beautiful in the way that even as those who have been set apart by God in this community are coming to understand what discipleship means. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have, two not different. Well, they are different, but they are within the same, arena of thought. You have the process of discipleship and drawing others up, and then you have another process, which is, or responsibility, which is that of leadership, and that of basically being a good steward with what you have been given. So a lot of the terms that we're using can be a little confusing because they can have a derogatory meaning. Like you could call a small person or a mean person, not mean ugly, but like you're small-minded. You know, you don't really think about much. Or you think, but you could also say someone is simple-minded and they could be a very great person because they don't complicate themselves beyond what they've been given. So in that context, a simple person would be admirable. And, you know, but the small-minded person, one who thinks in a certain way, would not be. And I think that's where we need to be clear in our own minds of the differentiations of some of even the words that are used here. Because you can have a man who is a duke or a ruler, and he can be a very simple man, but that doesn't make him unwise. And then you can also have, you know, the same guy that is small-minded, and he becomes a despised ruler because he tries to do things in a certain way. And that would apply as well to someone who is not of great means, but a very wise person. And that is commendable nonetheless, because they do well in relationship and in what they have been in possession with all that they have. And from God's perspective, that is the place of his judgment, in the sense of, you know, whether you have done well with what you have been given. So in essence, it's not how much you've been given, it's how you do with what you have. And it would take a certain kind of wisdom to do well with what you have, regardless of how much you've been given. So that would apply to material means and also by way of relationship and of responsibility in life. So, Jade, any thoughts on your part? You've been quiet today.
That's intentional.
Yeah? Letting it soak? Any other thoughts? I don't think we've got time to move on to another Analect, so to end on time is kind of like ending early these days, especially since we started a few minutes late. Quiet crowd. Any other thoughts about what I read in the Tao Te Ching?
You remember in Story of the World when we read about some ruler, I think it was in China, like the rulers made some kind of motto about if the bird something doesn't want to sing, like, I'll make it sing. What was that? I don't remember what that was. I don't know if you guys remember that either, but I don't know what you read from the Tao Te Ching kind of reminded me of that.
Reminded you of that?
Yeah.
This is just a very interesting perspective on, you know, the value and not unmerited but unnoticed benefit that a good leader can have. You know, if you break that down, when the master governs, the people are hardly aware that he exists. That's the master. So this is the best way that it can possibly be done, is that there's such a mutual benefit in the way that all things work together, that as it's said at the end, then it is perceived that they did it on their own. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't know that they have a leader, but that things work well and that they fully participate in it, and their participation is equal to their ownership in it. So that's why they would be able to say, we did this all on our own, we did this ourselves. So that's not them thinking highly of themselves, it's just a very unresisted way for things to work out. So the next is a leader who is loved. So he's not, they know that this is a good person that does things well and that benefits them, but very much makes their present, his or her presence known for their endearment, not because he wants their praise, but because he's engaged in a certain way. The next is the one that is feared. So he's going to have a lot more control and, in a sense, grasp on their life. And so whenever they do what they do, so the one who is loved, they may do everything that they do out of an affection for their leader, but not necessarily for the greater whole, which at the end of the day seems like just a benefit for themselves, but done in such a way that it benefits the whole. The second is that they may do it for their affection towards a good person. The third, they do it because they know that there's going to be a consequence if they don't. The despised leader is one who is obviously exploiting the people and, has become a bit of a tyrant. So they don't want that leader. So you have these levels of trust. So the first, the master, the trust is mutual. Even with the loved leader, the trust is toward the goodness of this leader. So it's broken from that full mutual trust. That is, we all work together in this. The other is, I don't really trust this person, but I have to do what they say. And the final is, I don't trust this person and I don't want to do what they say. There's this huge disparity. So that's why it says, if you don't trust the people, you make them untrustworthy. The master doesn't talk, he acts. When his work is done, the people say, amazing, we did it all by ourselves. Yes, I did. I have mentioned this before, but I've seen, Apple TV has those, it goes into those screens where it shows various beautiful areas of the world and kind of almost like it's from a
like a drone.
Yeah, like a drone view or whatever. And like some of those areas in China where you have these beautiful countrysides, but you see these
Rice fields?
Rice field one?
yeah, the rice fields, but what's it called when you terraced? You have literally like mountains that are terraced down. So like massive acreage. And I think about when those were formed in antiquity, they're not natural formations. Those were done one shovel at a time by thousands and thousands of people over hundreds and hundreds of years. And they have become, something that is of great value to the peoples of those areas that benefit from their produce. And, that was much of there were obviously a lot of really terrible things done under the various rulers in China, but Confucius himself is reminiscing on some of the ancients that ruled well in righteousness and laid such a great foundation for who they were as a nation. So much of what Confucius' writings were about were looking back to what had been accomplished by those former rulers, not just by way of infrastructure, but by the way they ruled. So, and it obviously we look at these things because of the obvious parallels that there are to what it means to be a righteous man and a mature son in God's house as it relates to the responsibility that we are given and from God himself. It's almost a direct parallel. So, and we can see those played out in some of the rulers of antiquity. The difference between Saul and David, the difference between David and his son Solomon, the difference between Solomon and his son Jeroboam were dramatically different. And the passing of power between those three kings, you can see some very dramatic changes in every aspect of the kingdom. The entrustment of the people, the endearment of the people, the use of resources, all of those things. Where, with Solomon in the latter part of his life, he had been given the greatest kingdom on earth, literally. Peace around all his sides, every nation around them coming to pay tribute to them. I mean, that was a type of the kingdom of God on earth in the future. But what did Solomon ultimately do with that? Or ultimately, what did his son Jeroboam do with that? Because, see, Solomon's kingdom, with the building of the temple and the establishment of great infrastructure and the continuation of peace from the surrounding nations, came up, that was very taxing on the people. And the people were seeing the benefit of that. But at the time that there was a power change between Solomon and his son Jeroboam, he did not receive the wisdom of the advisors that his father had, which was a very prosperous but challenging time of development. And that was good challenge, a lot of work. But remember, the elders and advisors said, you have a great kingdom now. Why don't you, almost the exact advice that is being requested by Duke A here. The advisor said, the people have worked hard. Why don't you give them some relief? Now, and the major difference is that with the Duke here, it was after famine. But with Solomon, it was after great prosperity. Why not? So that should highlight the foolishness of Jeroboam, who basically, in essence, said, well, my father taxed them this way. I'm going to tax them double that. I'm not going to go to 10. I'm going to go to 40% tax. I'm going to be harder. And you better not complain about it. So what did that do by way of his leadership and entrustment to the people? Well, he became very quickly a despised leader. And who advised him? Who gave him such ill advice? His young contemporaries, who had a mindset. Now that was kind of pointing back to what Noah said. Hey, this will benefit us. Let's do something for ourselves. So they did not have the nation in mind, the commoner in mind whatsoever. Neither did they take into account where they had come from. Very, very unwise. Interesting how these scenarios overlap basically any situation of governance, rule, and use and responsibility across the globe. And these principles are indifferent to form of government. All right, let's pray and close up. Started at 10:10, we'll end at 11:11. Isaac, can you close us up?
Father, I do bless your holy name. Father, I also bless the hearts of your people. Even the rest of this day, Lord, that we allow you to continue to move. We are continually thankful for what you are showing us, Lord, even in a time like this. Thank you for Tim and John, whose hearts are for us and for you. Continue to bless them, Lord. Continue to bless the younger generation and what you're doing in the hearts and minds, in the everyday. Father, let us not presume that we know. Amen.
Amen. All right.